Local history that changed a nation. The Gettysburg Address. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little know, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. One of only 5 copies in Abraham Lincoln's hand of the Gettysburg Address lives here at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum in Springfield. And we're kind of fortunate that Ken Burns decided not to come here because the real experts on the Gettysburg Address and Abraham Lincoln's life reside here, and Dr. James Cornelius is one of them. Mm-hmm. You're the curator of the Lincoln collection.
Yes, Mark.
And it's a big day, isn't it? The 150th anniversary of the Gettysburg
It's a very big day. Everybody likes round numbers. President Lincoln liked round numbers, and this is a major event because it gives us a chance to remember our nation's history and our founding ideals all at once.
What is it about the Gettysburg Address that resonates with people and stays with them through their life?
Well, I think it works at different levels for different people. It's very short, and almost anybody can memorize it, and lots of people have. It also has allusions to biblical language. It has allusions to our Declaration of Independence. It has the necessary part of it that's about consecrating the dead, the brave soldiers, and it speaks to our future, that we need a new birth of freedom to complete this nation, this union.
You know, it's interesting. I said that there are 5 copies in his hand, and one of them is here. And you told me, I didn't know this, they're all different.
Yeah, all 5 are different, a little bit. There are 2 more or less incomplete. They kind of look like rough drafts. One was a sort of a rough draft that were left behind with his secretaries in Washington. And then there's one that he read from at Gettysburg, which no longer exists. But then the one here, he wrote out at the request of Edward Everett after the event, Edward Everett being the main speaker that day for 2 hours. And Everett's copy and Lincoln's handwritten copy were sold for charity for wounded soldiers in New York City the next spring. And it's the first one. We're very proud of this year because we have Everett's notebook. We've got the whole day's events here in Springfield. But it's the first one in which the words "under God" appear. Those are not in the first 2 drafts that he left behind, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom.
Let's visit with the family here for a second, okay? Because during this time, and much of this program is going to be what was going on with Lincoln at the time preceding the Gettysburg Address.
Yeah.
Some personal things, real personal issues were going on in Abraham Lincoln's life. For instance, the health of his son.
Yes. Well, Tad had smallpox at the time. A few days before the president was scheduled to go up to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Tad was in bed, and the president himself wasn't feeling very well either. But we don't think that Mr. Lincoln would have skipped the trip if he'd felt kind of sickly himself. But he was worried about Tad, and so was Mary. But their family doctor told them, Tad's getting better, he'll be all right. And this was a big relief. And while the president was in Gettysburg, he got a telegram from Mary back in Washington saying, Tad's better today, too. So this put the president's mind at ease a little bit more before he gave the speech.
Some people think, well, they know Tad had smallpox. Some people think Abraham had smallpox.
Yeah, he seems to have had a kind of a weak variety of it, a mild case of it called varioloid, not the full-blown problem. And he may have given it to Tad. Tad may have given it to him. Abraham may have given it to the black man William Johnson, his servant.
Who's William Johnson?
William Johnson was a black man who came with the Lincolns from Springfield to Washington, D.C. on the train in 1861 and was the president's manservant and his contact with the African-American community in Washington, the way Mary Lincoln had Elizabeth Keckley, much better known figure, as her contact with African Americans. And so Lincoln took William along as his sort of friend, bodyguard, inspiration. He probably finished writing up the last final touches on the Gettysburg Address in the presence of William Johnson on the night of the 18th in Gettysburg.
Now, William Johnson met his untimely demise because of smallpox, is that right?
That's right, yes.
And he may have contracted it from Abraham Lincoln.
Well, somebody gave it to somebody, all in that circle. They're all traveling together and living together. Lots of people had it at the time. General McClellan had a bad case of it 2 years earlier. And so the Lincolns were very worried. Their son, Willie, had died in the White House the previous year of typhoid. Unfortunately, as you say, William Johnson died of smallpox in early January, about 6-7 weeks after the trip to Gettysburg. And President Lincoln paid for his burial at Arlington National Cemetery. And the gravestone is still there. It says William H. Johnson, citizen.
Citizen.
Citizen. He's one of those people for whom Lincoln was writing the Gettysburg Address.
It would have been unusual for a president, I think, to pay for a burial at Arlington, especially of a black man.
Unprecedented as far as we know.
Yeah.
Arlington Cemetery, formerly in the possession of Robert E. Lee of Virginia, that was family property. There were unknown numbers of buried slaves on that land, but William Johnson would have been among the very first free blacks buried there. And now, of course, it's anyone with the credentials such as Robert Lincoln, later Secretary of War, who is buried there also, as well as soldiers of all races.
One last question about the Gettysburg Address and the sort of one of the oddities of it. It wasn't usual for a president to dedicate a cemetery, or was it the first national cemetery? It was an unusual thing for a president to do, was it not?
You're right. This was an unusual event. It was historic in world history in the sense that the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863 was the largest conflict ever fought in the Western Hemisphere, ever. And it was not the very first national cemetery in this country, but it was nearly the first, and it was certainly the biggest. And so to properly bury, to properly thank and consecrate all those soldiers fighting for their ideals in Pennsylvania, it was thought a good idea to have the nation's leading orator, Edward Everett, give the main speech, and the president to give the dedication itself of the cemetery. And that is unusual. So that Mr. Lincoln is sort of acting as the chaplain in a way. He's the chaplain of the armed forces. He's the chaplain of the whole people in the horrific struggle, killing hundreds of thousands of men that was continuing.
Dr. Cornelius, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark.
Mark Depew, we can't really judge Lincoln's mood and what was going on in his life leading up to the Gettysburg Address unless we talk about the Civil War, because he lived that war. It consumed him, didn't it?
It absolutely did. And An example of that, I think, is that he spent a huge amount of time always at the War Office's telegraph office, so he could hear the messages coming back from his various battle commanders across the country. And it's interesting at this point in time in American history, what's different is you've got railroads that changes the dynamics of the war altogether, makes these things much larger battles than ever would have been before. And you've also got the telegraph, which makes instantaneous communication with the battlefield commanders. Once you get on the battlefield itself, it's still the old-fashioned signal flags and couriers and things like that, but he could find out almost immediately what was happening, as long as you can get to a telegraph wire and send those messages back.
He's writing the Gettysburg Address. Let's say it's October, early November. He's writing the Gettysburg Address. Based on what was going on in the various battles around the country, what kind of mood is he in?
Well, he's got the tremendous victories both at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. Gettysburg on July 3rd with a resounding defeat of the Confederates. He's upset, seriously upset with General Meade, because Meade let Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia slip away one more time, and they crossed the Potomac River without causing serious damage. So Lincoln's seriously upset, but he's still got this great victory on northern battlefield at Gettysburg. And then the next day, July 4th, is this tremendous victory that Grant delivers him with the surrender of the entire garrison at the city of Vicksburg, which opens up the entire Mississippi River now to control by the Union forces, and essentially cuts the Confederacy in half.
But it's not all good news, is it? Because at this particular moment, I mean, Vicksburg's good news for him.
Yeah.
But at this particular moment, he's got another army in trouble, doesn't he?
Yeah, and you're referring to the Army of Cumberland that's under General Rosecrans, and on September 18th through the 20th, the Army of Cumberland fights the Army of the Tennessee in Chickamauga, Georgia. It's about 10 miles south of Chattanooga. On September 20th, the Union forces are seriously routed, absolutely routed, and there's a horrendous mistake by the Union leadership that opens up a huge gap that Longstreet's corps drives right through and ends up complete rout, and they retreat back to Chattanooga. So at the time that Lincoln is considering what he wants to say when he's delivering this address at Gettysburg, he's got this horrendous defeat at Chickamauga on his mind, I'm sure. And one of the ironies of this war, you know, this is the war of brother against brother, cousin against cousin, and that's certainly the case at the Battle of Chickamauga, maybe more than any other battle we can think of, because there's these Kentucky regiments that are serving on both sides of the war. And unfortunately, on the morning of September 20th, leading a brigade of Kentucky Confederates is one General Benjamin Helm, who is Mary Lincoln and President Lincoln's favorite brother-in-law. He happens to be married to Mary's sister, and he is mortally wounded in that battle. So that's got to be on his mind as well.
So he's mourning, in addition to everything, he's mourning as well, isn't he?
Yes. So you've got Gettysburg, which had the highest number of casualties for the entire war, and Chickamauga a couple months later, a resounding defeat for the Union forces, and that's the second highest level of casualties that they suffer.
Then, though, for Lincoln, there is good news, because just north of that at Chattanooga, where his army has been under siege because of this rout at Chickamauga, some positive things happened there.
Well, yes, but not quite yet. I mean, what had happened after Chickamauga, as you mentioned, the Union forces retreat to Chattanooga, and they're under siege now at Chattanooga for 2 months. For about a month and a half of that, they're living on reduced rations. In fact, by late October, the troops there at Chattanooga are down to 1/4 rations. And you can't sustain an army for long on 1/4 rations. They weren't totally encircled, but the road network, wagon trains trying to go over mountain ranges to get supplies to the troops in Chattanooga, were absolutely not able to do that. And in fact, one case, the Confederate cavalry had a raid and actually caught one of the wagon trains. Can you imagine an 800 wagon train going over the mountains north of, in southern Tennessee, trying to get to the city of Chattanooga? Totally destroyed, all of the wagons burned, and most of the horses and mules slaughtered right there in the spot. And that's the route that Grant is going to take when he's given command. He relieves Rosecrans in about early October time frame, after this fiasco at Chickamauga. So Grant comes in on this road, and he's driving over the same terrain and seeing all these burned wagons and slaughtered animals on the roadside as he's trying to fight his way in there. And so it's looking good. By the time we get to early or mid-November time frame, Grant is reinforcing. He's got General Hooker with a corps of troops, about 15,000 troops coming from the Virginia theater that are already on the scene or getting there. And soon to arrive is General Sherman with another couple corps, about 20,000 troops coming over from Vicksburg. They're not there yet at the time that Lincoln is thinking about writing the Gettysburg Address. So Grant's hope is once he's got Sherman on the scene, he can turn the tables and bust out of this siege that the Confederates have laid on them at Chattanooga.
Thank you very much. As this booklet, On Lincoln's Mind, put out by the Papers of Abraham Lincoln, we're going to learn that, boy, during this tense time, during the middle of the Civil War, the presidency and all the matters associated to the presidency does not stop, does it? It doesn't matter what's going on. Daniel Stoll, you and your colleagues put this together. It's a remarkable collection of day-to-day activities that the president was confronted with.
Right. We are always amazed at the number of different issues he had to deal with on a daily basis and move from one to another so rapidly and make decisions in some cases of life and death.
He was, of course, every president was, but he was constantly bombarded with requests for help. People wanted to get a relative a job. People wanted, you know, a grieving mother would want her son's body back from the war front. Yeah. Things like this. And you and I have just enough time to go into a few of these requests. Some of them are a little offbeat. Some of them are daily. Right. And some of them are kind of remarkable in some ways. A lot of people would not be aware that during the first instance in your booklet here, you talk about the fact that he's requested to do something about these riots in New York City. Right. What in the world was going on?
Well, New York City was very upset, or a lot of people in New York City were very upset about the federal drafts. And this is just literally in the days after the Battle of Gettysburg. And unfortunately, the opposition to the draft turned deadly. It turned into an opposition toward all things related to the federal government, and it turned into a racist draft. So a lot of, or a racist riot, and so a lot of the victims of the draft riots were African Americans living in New York City. And ironically, soldiers who had recently been at the Battle of Gettysburg had to be dispatched to New York City to help restore order.
Mm-hmm. And of course, they were asking the president to either knock off the draft or to send troops up there to knock off the draft, so they could quell the riots.
Exactly. They wanted to hold off on the draft. And the other thing we have to remember at this time is that there are constant elections going on, whether they're municipal elections or state elections. They didn't all happen at the same time of the year, every 2 years, the way we're familiar with now. And so there are elections and therefore politicians who are always very concerned about what's going on and about the next election. And so there were many requests to either suspend or postpone the draft in a particular area, to keep the peace or to allow someone to get elected, or and of course the Democratic opposition used the draft as a major example of the tyranny of the Lincoln administration.
And while these African Americans are being injured and killed in some riots here, we're seeing over in St. Louis, we're seeing a sort of another real issue where freed blacks are being kidnapped.
Right.
And then sold back into slavery. So they were requesting the president to do something about this too.
We have an example of a letter from here in Springfield, Illinois, to the president, making him aware of what was perceived to be a conspiracy by which free blacks and freed blacks were being kidnapped in St. Louis, then transported across southern Illinois on the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad to Louisville, Kentucky, where they would be sold into slavery. And of course, Louisville and Kentucky generally had been exempt from the provisions of the Emancipation Proclamation. So even though we're here in the fall of 1863, months after the Emancipation Proclamation, slavery is still legal in Kentucky. Obviously, kidnapping free blacks is not legal, and so they're requesting Lincoln to order his subordinate military officers in St. Louis to put a stop to this.
I see. Okay, so they're allowing it to continue.
According to this correspondent.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's another thing that's important here is that just because Lincoln receives these letters doesn't mean they're all true or they're the whole truth. Now, in this case, it very well may have happened, and certainly it's true that free blacks in various parts of the North were kidnapped and sold into slavery. I don't dispute that, but how extensive this conspiracy was, this is something that Lincoln has to try to ascertain. Are military officials complicit in this trade? Do they know anything about it? How extensive is it? He has to sort through the truth and exaggeration and all of these things from all of these correspondence.
The presidency has changed so much. A president today, these letters would never reach his level.
Right.
They'd all be taken care of by staff or not taken care of, whatever they decide to do. But they would not reach him, and he wouldn't have to do investigative work to find out whether there's anything to these claims.
He did have a staff of 2 private secretaries who did serve a bit of a filtering function for him. They certainly filtered out a lot of the death threats that he received and some of the other nastier things. But we're constantly amazed at how many letters have Lincoln's handwriting on it, referring it to someone within the government for further investigation, asking for the opinion of one of his cabinet officers, asking that something be done by a subordinate, either civil or military subordinate, and there are just thousands of these. So we know that Lincoln, saw it and wrote and at least skimmed it and wrote on it because we have thousands of those.
And referred it to somebody in his administration
Exactly.
to take care of. Governor Yates, at the time the governor of Illinois during the
Right.
Civil War, you also have an instance in here where he appealed to the president or gave the president news about the up in Rock Island. What was that instance?
Well, the Rock Island Arsenal was being built on the island of Rock Island, which is part of Illinois. But there were local rumors afoot that for some reason the island of Rock Island, and therefore the Rock Island Arsenal, were going to be put under the jurisdiction of Iowa. Well, this points out, and whether there was any basis in fact for that or not, what Yates was asking Lincoln to do was to quell these rumors by saying definitely the Rock Island Arsenal will be within the Illinois military district. The reason that Lincoln would have to pay attention to it is that he really relied on governors in a way that we're not familiar with today. I mean, the federal system was alive and well. As we mentioned earlier, drafts were implemented state by state. So raising the troops, equipping the troops, transporting the troops, that was all done at a state level. And so when he had supporters like Governor Richard Yates, who was a Republican and was a strong supporter of Lincoln, not a blind follower, but a strong supporter, he certainly had to make sure that he kept them happy. And he had other governors who weren't as supportive, both Republicans and Democrats. So it's important that he address their concerns. And some of them, the Indiana governor, for example, seems almost to have written him 3 times a day, or sent him a telegraph 3 times a day, because they were just a voluminous correspondence. And again, another Republican governor that he depended on, but he had to take these concerns seriously.
We discussed earlier in this program that there was they believe that Tad Lincoln had smallpox. And Mary, of course, was very concerned about her. And you have an instance in the booklet here talk about the things that were on Lincoln's mind, even his own family's health.
Absolutely. And this is actually occurring right when he's leaving to go to Gettysburg to deliver the Gettysburg Address. And the day before, he's already in Gettysburg, there's a telegram from Mary saying the doctor's been here, and it seems that Tad is getting better. Obviously, they were very concerned parents, as any parents would be, but they were particularly concerned because, of course, they'd lost 2 children to illness. Eddie Lincoln in 1850, and then Willie Lincoln in 1862 in the White House. And so anytime that Tad was ill, and he was about 10 or 11 years old at this point, they were very concerned. And ultimately he does obviously get better and recovers from that illness, but a couple of days after the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln is writing to the main speaker, Edward Everett, and Everett had very graciously asked about Tad's health, and he says that he is getting better, and so that they were relieved in that instance. And Tad does outlive his father, but not by that long. He dies when he's 18 years old, about 6 years after his father was assassinated.
In putting this booklet together, On Lincoln's Mind, Leading the Nation to the Gettysburg Address. Did you and your colleagues gain an appreciation for not only the presidency, but for this particular man and how he was handling things leading up to the Gettysburg Address?
Yes, I mean, we knew that he was a very busy president. We know from all the documents that we've assembled that he was very busy. And actually, the 24 or so documents that are presented here are from a group of about 2,500 letters to Lincoln during the 4.5 months between the Battle of Gettysburg and the presentation of the Gettysburg Address. So we had many, many, many documents to choose from. And even more when we finish our search, because we're still searching at the National Archives and finding additional documents. So we have more documents that are coming in all the time. And we've always been struck by his industry, by how much he worked. His secretary said that he slept very little, he ate very little and quickly, and was working almost all the time. Contemporaries sometimes criticized him for going to the theater or, in their view, wasting time on amusement. But really, going to the theater and reading were his only amusements. He particularly liked the comic authors of the day, and sometimes would read those to his secretaries or to his cabinet members, sometimes to the annoyance of his cabinet members. But it was for him a sort of mental relaxation in reading these stories and laughing about them and reading them to others, because he did have so many things weighing on his mind. And that was what really struck us from the beginning, and that's why we titled it On Lincoln's Mind, is that not all of these documents obviously feed into the Gettysburg Address, but all of these issues and more were on his mind, and yet he had the clarity of thought and expression to create this masterpiece, explaining to his contemporaries and to the world forever what the Civil War was about.
Yeah. Well, Daniel, thank you very much. It's an impressive piece of work. I appreciate you being with us.
My pleasure.
The booklet, On Lincoln's Mind, is available here at the library and museum throughout the week of the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address. And the Gettysburg Address itself, one of only 5 written in Lincoln's hand, is on display here through the weekend after Thanksgiving. Now, this has been a special presentation of the Gettysburg Address, Reflections from Lincoln's Hometown. Thanks for watching.